Chapter 1. The Early History of Persia, Tribal Societies and Early Settlements. The history of Persia, today's Iran, begins long before the emergence of the well-known empires of antiquity. Even in prehistoric times, the area between the Caspian Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the mountains of Central Asia was inhabited. Archaeological finds show that people lived here over 10,000 years ago, farming, raising livestock, and founding primitive settlements. These early communities were still strongly influenced by natural conditions. Mountains, rivers, and deserts determined the way of life and led to a fragmentation of settlements. The region of Persia was favored by its geographical diversity. The fertile valleys, especially the Zagros Mountains and the plains of Fars and Kerman, made it possible to grow cereals, legumes, and later cotton. Rivers such as the Karon or the Zayande carried sufficient water to develop smaller agricultural systems that supported the first sedentary communities. This early agriculture made it possible to produce surpluses, which in turn laid the foundation for social differentiation, trade, and the formation of the first political structures. The early history of Persia is closely linked to the formation of tribal societies. Different ethnic groups and tribes, such as the Medians and Persians, lived in loose associations that were connected by kinship and common economic interests. These tribal structures offered protection from external dangers, enabled the sharing of resources, and formed the first social hierarchies. In addition to having military duties, the tribal leaders were also responsible for managing the community, dividing up land, and resolving internal conflicts. From the 3rd millennium BC onwards, evidence of the first cultural and religious developments can be found. Sanctuaries, tombs, and cultic sites indicate that the early Persians already had complex beliefs that worshipped natural forces, ancestor cults, and early gods. These religious practices influenced not only everyday life, but also the social order by legitimizing power structures and strengthening the cohesion of the community. Parallel to the tribal societies, trade between the settlements slowly developed. Archaeological finds of pottery, tools, and jewelry from different regions show that an exchange of goods and ideas took place as early as the 3rd millennium BC. In particular, the trade routes through the mountain ranges and along the rivers enabled the spread of technological innovations such as bronze processing, pottery, and early forms of characters. This economic networking laid the foundation for later state structures. A decisive step in early history was the development of cities. The first fortified settlements, such as those in Susa or Anshan, emerged as centers of administration, trade, and religion. These early cities were still small, but they formed the foundation for later political integration among the great Persian empires. The city was understood not only as a place to live, but also as a center of social control, economic organization, and religious practice. Early Persian society was thus strongly influenced by an interaction between nature, tribal structure, and economic development. While geography determined the way of life, technological innovations and trade enabled growing social differentiation. The first leadership structures, religious institutions, and trade networks set the stage for the later emergence of great empires that would shape Persia for centuries. The early history of Persia also shows that the region has always been an intersection of cultures. Located between Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the Indus Valley, Persia benefited from cultural influences while at the same time developing its own traditions. This mixture of geographical location, tribal structures, religious practices, and economic development laid the foundation for the later greatness of the Persian empires from the Achaemenids to the Sassanids and beyond. In short, the early history of Persia is the story of deserted valleys, first settlements, tribal societies, and the gradual rise of complex social structures. It shows how an originally scattered and heterogeneous area grew into a region that was ready to become one of the most powerful empires of antiquity under kings such as Cyrus and Darius I. The achievements of this period, agriculture, urban planning, tribal organization, trade, and religious institutions form the foundation of Persia's long, fascinating history. Chapter 2. The Achaemenid Empire: Foundation, Expansion, and Administration. The founding of the Achaemenid Empire marked the beginning of a new era in the history of Persia. Characterized by territorial expansion, centralized administration, and cultural diversity, the empire developed into one of the largest empires of antiquity under the leadership of the Achaemenids. Its founder, Cyrus the Great, laid the foundation for a political system that combined both military strength and pragmatic administration, and that would shape Persia for centuries. The Achaemenids originally came from the area of today's Fars in southern Iran. Cyrus, who rose as a tribal leader, used both military tactics and diplomatic strategies to unite rival tribes. His rise to power began with the subjugation of neighboring Persian tribes and the creation of a stable core empire. Cyrus understood that military successes alone were not enough. He combined conquest with the integration of the subjugated peoples, allowed limited autonomy to local rulers, and established a central administration that effectively organized taxes, recruitment, and trade. One of Cyrus's first great achievements was the conquest of the Medes Empire around 550 BC, which had previously held a dominant position in the region. In doing so, he not only united the Persians and Medes under one rule, but also created the starting point for further expansion. Shortly afterwards, the campaigns against the Lydian kingdom in Asia Minor and the Babylonian conquest followed, whereby Cyrus created an empire that stretched from the Indus in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west. His conquests were not only militarily impressive, but also politically adept. He respected local customs and religions, which strengthened the loyalty of the subjugated peoples. Cyrus's son and successor, Cambyses II, continued its expansion into Egypt. Although his reign was marked by internal unrest and uprising, he consolidated control over the new territories and prepared the ground for comprehensive administration under Darius I. Darius, who ascended the throne in 522 BC, was a master of organization. He divided the vast empire into satrapies, administrative districts led by local governors, the satraps. This structure allowed for both local autonomy and central control, a combination that kept the Achaemenid Empire stable. The administration was characterized by a sophisticated system of taxes, infrastructure, and communication. Darius introduced standardized coins, promoted the expansion of roads and canals, and built the famous King's Road, which connected the capital, Persepolis, with the remote provinces. This infrastructure facilitated the transport of troops, goods, and messages, and contributed decisively to the coherence of the vast empire. Messengers were thus able to get from one border to another within a few weeks, an achievement that was extraordinary in antiquity. Militarily, the Achaemenid Empire was organized flexibly. While there was a standing army, the empire mainly used troops from the respective provinces, who were recruited from among the satraps. This system allowed for both local autonomy and central control, a combination that kept the Achaemenid Empire stable. The administration was characterized by a sophisticated system of taxes, infrastructure, and communication. Darius introduced standardized coins, promoted the expansion of roads and canals, and built the famous King's Road, which connected the capital, Persepolis, with the remote provinces. This infrastructure facilitated the transport of troops, goods, and messages, and contributed decisively to the coherence of the vast empire. Messengers were thus able to get from one border to another within a few weeks, an achievement that was extraordinary in antiquity. Militarily, the Achaemenid Empire was organized flexibly. While there was a standing army, the empire mainly used troops from the respective provinces, who were recruited from among the satraps. This system allowed for both local autonomy and central control, a combination that kept the Achaemenid Empire stable. The administration was characterized by a sophisticated system of taxes, infrastructure, and communication. Darius introduced standardized coins, promoted the expansion of roads and canals, and built the famous King's Road, which connected the capital Persepolis with the remote provinces. This infrastructure facilitated the transport of troops, goods, and messages, and contributed decisively to the coherence of the vast empire. Messengers were thus able to get from one border to another within a few weeks, an achievement that was extraordinary in antiquity. Militarily, the Achaemenid Empire was organized flexibly. While there was a standing army, the empire mainly used troops from the respective provinces, who were recruited from among the satraps. This system allowed for the rapid mobilization of large and diverse forces that could both defend the borders and suppress insurgencies. The Persians also developed specialized units, including archers, cavalry, and heavy infantry, which were crucial in the campaigns against Greece, Egypt, and other regions. The Achaemenid Empire was also characterized by cultural and religious tolerance. Under Cyrus and Darius, local traditions, customs, and religions were respected. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, often referred to as the first declaration of human rights, documents that Cyrus granted religious freedom to subjugated peoples and allowed deportees to return to their homeland. This policy fostered loyalty, stabilized the empire, and set a standard that was unique to later empires. The combination of military strength, administrative efficiency, and cultural openness made the Achaemenid Empire a model for later state action. It was not only territorially large, but also politically complex, able to integrate a variety of ethnicities, languages, and religions. The capital Persepolis became the symbolic center of the empire and at the same time a place where administration, religion, and culture converged. In short, the Achaemenid Empire was a masterpiece of antiquity. Cyrus's military vision, Darius' organizational skills, and the political tolerance of the rulers made it possible to keep a vast, diverse empire stable for centuries. This empire laid the foundation for later Persian history and left a legacy in administration, military organization, infrastructure, and cultural integration that continue to have an impact long after the fall of the empire.
Chapter 3: The Reign of Cyrus the Great and Darius I. The reign of Cyrus the Great, c. 559 to 530 BC, and Darius I, 522 to 486 BC, forms a central phase in the history of Persia. Under their rule, the Achaemenid Empire developed from a regional power to one of the largest and best organized empires of antiquity. Their policies combined military expansion, administrative innovation, and cultural tolerance, which together laid the foundation for Persia's stability and influence for centuries. Cyrus came from the tribe of the Achaemenids in today's Fars area. His early reign was marked by the unification of the Persian tribes and the subjugation of the neighboring Medes. This was a masterpiece both militarily and politically. Cyrus used not only military strength, but also diplomatic skill. He granted defeated peoples extensive autonomy, respected their religious traditions, and integrated them into the empire instead of oppressing them. This approach strengthened loyalty and reduced the risk of riots, which laid the foundation for later expansion. Cyrus's military achievement was extraordinary. He conquered the Lydian kingdom in Asia Minor, including the wealthy city of Sardis, and thus controlled important trade routes. The conquest of Babylon in 539 BC was particularly noteworthy. Without much destruction, Cyrus managed to take over the city peacefully. His famous Cyrus Cylinder documents that he allowed the inhabitants to return to their homeland and granted religious freedom, an early form of political and religious tolerance that was unusual in antiquity. After Cyrus's death, his son Cambyses II briefly took over the reign and expanded the empire into Egypt. However, his reign was marked by uprisings and internal conflicts, which is why the successful rise of Darius I had a decisive influence on the stabilization of the empire. Darius, a relative of the Achaemenids, succeeded him in 522 BC after he had put down a civil war and several uprisings. Darius I was a master of administration and the organization of the empire. He divided the Achaemenid Empire into satrapies, administrative districts ruled by satraps. These officials had great power in their provinces, but were directly responsible to the king. This system allowed for effective tax collection, troop mobilization, and control over far-flung areas. Darius introduced standardized coins that facilitated trade and laid out an extensive network of roads, including the famous King's Road, which connected the capital Persepolis with the border regions. Darius' military policy was closely linked to his administration. He developed a standing army, supplemented by troops of the satrapies, which could be mobilized quickly if necessary. This structure made it possible to fight both internal uprisings and external threats, for example from Greek city-states or nomadic tribes of Central Asia. At the same time, Darius promoted the navy, which gave Persia control over the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea and secure trade routes. Another important aspect was cultural and religious tolerance under Darius. Unlike many ancient rulers, he pursued a policy of integration. Local customs, religions, and languages were respected, as long as loyalty to the king was maintained. This policy not only contributed to stability, but also facilitated the administration of a multi-ethnic empire that stretched from India to the Aegean Sea. Darius also initiated extensive construction projects that not only demonstrated prestige, but also had practical functions. Persepolis was built as an administrative center, religious place, and symbol of power. Canals, roads, and warehouses facilitated trade and supplies for the troops. This infrastructure made the Achaemenid Empire resilient both economically and militarily. The reign of Cyrus and Darius shows how a combination of military strength, diplomatic intelligence, and organizational efficiency could stabilize a vast empire. Cyrus's vision of tolerant conquest and Darius's ability to manage and develop infrastructure made the Achaemenid Empire one of the most successful empires of the ancient world. Her reign laid the foundation for Persia's influence for centuries, politically, economically, and culturally. These achievements had long-term effects. The administrative system of the satrapies influenced later empires. The infrastructure facilitated trade and communication over long distances, and the policy of religious and cultural tolerance became the model for many later great empires. Cyrus and Darius thus left behind a legacy that established Persia not only as a regional player, but also as a global player.
Chapter 4. Culture, Religion, and Administration in the Achaemenid Empire. The heyday of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great, Cambyses II, and Darius I was marked not only by military expansion and political organization, but also by a remarkable cultural, religious, and administrative development. The empire stretched from the Indus in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, uniting a multitude of peoples, languages, and religions. This diversity presented the rulers with the challenge of maintaining unity and order without destroying local identities. The way this was achieved shaped Persian culture and administrative systems for centuries. The administration of the Achaemenid Empire was based on a centralized but at the same time decentralized system. Darius I divided the empire into about 20 satrapies, administrative districts led by satraps. These officials were responsible for tax revenues, the judiciary, and the military security of their regions. Although they acted largely autonomously in their territories, they were accountable to the king. This system combined efficiency with local flexibility, allowing control over a vast, culturally heterogeneous empire. The tax policy of the Achaemenid Empire was a central part of the administration. Each satrapy had to pay a fixed sum of tribute, which could include both money and in kind. Darius introduced standardized coins, the darics, which facilitated trade and promoted economic stability. In addition, infrastructure projects such as roads, bridges, and canals have been promoted to improve transport and communication.
The famous Royal Road, which connected Persepolis with Susa, Ecbatana, and Sardis, was a central element of this strategy, allowing for rapid communication and troop movements. Religion played an important role in the Achaemenid Empire, but was characterized by tolerance. While Zoroastrianism, the Persian religion, had a dominant position under Cyrus and Darius, the rulers respected the religious customs of the subjugated peoples. Cyrus, for example, allowed the Jews in Babylon to return to their homeland after conquering their city and reconstruct the temple. This policy of religious freedom strengthened the loyalty of the subjugated peoples and contributed to the stability of the empire. The cultural diversity of the Achaemenid Empire was also reflected in architecture and administration. The capital, Persepolis, became a center of architecture, religion, and administration. Monumental palaces, administrative complexes, and festival halls not only demonstrated power and wealth, but also served as places of bureaucratic organization. Works of art from different regions, created or collected in the empire, testify to the appreciation of local traditions and the integration of different cultural elements. Another important element was the integration of peoples and languages. The Achaemenid Empire included many ethnic groups: Persians, Medes, Lydians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, and many more. To facilitate administration, official languages such as Aramaic were used, which played a unifying role in the bureaucracy and communication between the satrapies. This linguistic standardization made it possible to administer efficiently without suppressing the cultural identity of the individual peoples. The Achaemenid Empire was also characterized by economic and technical innovations. Agricultural production was promoted, irrigation systems were expanded, and extensive trade networks were created that reached as far as Greece, India, and Egypt. The empire benefited from its location on important trade routes and combined economic success with political stability. Militarily, the Achaemenid administration was closely linked to the culture and organization. Each satrapy had to provide troops for the king, which gave the empire a flexible army that could be mobilized quickly. At the same time, soldiers of different ethnic origins were integrated into the armies, which promoted not only military efficiency but loyalty to the central state. The reign of Cyrus and Darius makes it clear that administration, culture, and religion were closely linked. By combining military strength, administrative efficiency, religious tolerance, and cultural integration, the Achaemenid Empire was able to remain stable for centuries and extend its influence over a vast territory. In summary, the Achaemenids developed a modern form of administration that went far beyond the mere conquest of land. They created a system that combined military strength, economic stability, cultural diversity, and religious tolerance. This combination made the empire not only powerful, but long-lived and shaped the political, cultural, and social landscape of Persia for centuries.
Chapter 5: The Conflict with Greece, Ionian Revolt and Persian Wars. The expansion of the Achaemenid Empire inevitably encountered the Greek city-states in Asia Minor, which at that time existed along the western coast of Asia Minor, today's Turkey. This region, known as Ionia, was politically and culturally strongly linked to the Greek poli on the mainland, but was under Persian influence after the conquest of Lydia by Cyrus and Darius I. The Ionians under Persian rule felt increasingly oppressed, igniting the spark for the first direct confrontation between Persia and Greece, the Ionian Revolt. The Ionian Revolt began in 499 BC in cities such as Miletus, Ephesus, and Samos, when Greek settlers rebelled against Persian control. They demanded freedom from the Persian satraps, who demanded high tributes and military obligations. The insurgents received support from some Greek city-states, notably Athens and Eretria, which provided ships, weapons, and military expertise. These interventions showed that Persia was a threat not only to its direct subjects, but also to the balance of power in the Aegean. Darius I reacted cautiously at first, but tried to suppress the uprising quickly and efficiently. Persian troops, led by experienced generals, were sent to Ionia to besiege and punish the cities. The sieges led to destruction, executions, and the return of the subjugated cities to Persian control. Despite the defeat of the Ionians, the revolt had a long-term effect. It drew Darius's attention to the increasing role of Athens and marked the beginning of the First Persian Wars, which were to influence the political landscape of Greece and Persia for decades. The Persian Wars themselves officially began in 492 BC, when Darius attempted to subjugate the Greek city-states that were resisting Persian control. Persia had one of the largest armies of antiquity, which included infantry, cavalry, and a highly developed fleet. Nevertheless, it quickly became clear that military superiority alone was not enough to defeat the fragmented and well-defended Greek city-states. The first significant conflict was the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, in which the Athenians repelled the Persian attack. Despite their numerical inferiority, the Greeks managed to defeat the Persian army through strategic understanding of the terrain, skillful tactics, and the use of heavy hoplites. The victory of Marathon had symbolic significance. It demonstrated that Persia was not invincible and strengthened the self-confidence of the Greek city-states. After Darius's death in 486 BC, Xerxes I continued his expansion. Under his leadership, the famous battles of Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea took place between 480 and 470 BC. Xerxes mobilized a formidable force that operated both by land and by sea. The Battle of Thermopylae, in which a small Greek force under King Leonidas held off the Persian troops for a long time, became a symbol of courage and resistance. However, the Persian fleet suffered a decisive defeat in 480 BC at the Battle of Salamis against the skillful tactics of the Greek forces. The narrowness of the waters off Salamis allowed the Greeks to use their smaller, agile ships effectively against the large Persian ships. This setback weakened the Persian initiative and marked the end of the major invasion attempts. The ensuing battles, including the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, eventually led to the final defeat of Persia on the mainland of Greece. The Persian expansion to the west was stopped, and the Greek city-states consolidated their independence. At the same time, Persia remained a great power, retaining its control over cities in Asia Minor and maintaining its administration and economic stability. The conflict with Greece had far-reaching consequences. At the military level, it showed that Persia, despite its size and organization, was not invincible. At the political level, it increased the Greeks' awareness of common defense and the building of alliances such as the Delish-Attic Sea League. For Persia, on the other hand, the experience of wars was instructive. They demonstrated the need to adapt military strategies to geographical conditions and to promote political integration of the subjugated peoples. In summary, the Ionian Revolt and the Persian Wars marked the first major direct confrontation between Persia and Greece. They posed challenges to the Achaemenid Empire that went beyond military strength and required dealing with cultural diversity, local autonomy, and strategic planning. These conflicts left a lasting legacy. They shaped the relationship between East and West, demonstrated the borders of even great empires, and laid the foundation for military and cultural developments in both Persia and Greece.
Chapter 6: Fall of the Achaemenid Empire by Alexander the Great. The Achaemenid Empire, which had flourished under Cyrus the Great and Darius I, ruled a vast territory in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, stretching from the Indus in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west. Despite its size, stable administration, and cultural tolerance, the empire was increasingly vulnerable to internal tensions, uprisings, and external threats. Alexander the Great, the king of Macedonia, took advantage of these weaknesses and thus initiated the end of the Achaemenid Empire. Alexander, a student of Aristotle and a strategic genius, had great ambitions from an early age. After the death of his father, Philip II, in 336 BC, he took over the Macedonian crown and set himself the goal of conquering the Persian Empire, which at that time was ruled by Darius III. Alexander united Greece under Macedonian leadership, created a highly motivated, well-equipped army, and began his campaign against Persia in 334 BC. The first decisive battle took place at Granikos on the west coast of Asia Minor. Alexander's troops, consisting of Macedonian phalanx, cavalry, and infantry units from Greece, defeated the Persian satrapy troops. This victory opened the way for Alexander to Asia Minor and demonstrated the superiority of his tactics, mobility, and discipline over the superior numbers of Persia. Alexander then moved on towards Sardis and Issos, where he faced Darius III in the famous Battle of Issos in 333 BC. The Persian army was numerically superior and had the traditional satrapic troops, cavalry units, and war elephants. Nevertheless, Alexander used the flexibility of his units, knowledge of the terrain, and the Macedonian phalanx to defeat the Persian army. Darius had to flee, his family was captured, and the moral authority of the Achaemenid king was badly damaged. The conquest of Egypt in 332 BC was another strategic milestone. Without major fighting, Alexander took control of the country and was recognized as pharaoh. In Egypt, he founded Alexandria, which was to become a cultural, economic, and scientific center of antiquity. The population welcomed Alexander as a liberator because he respected the existing structures and tolerated religious and local traditions. The decisive blow against the Achaemenid Empire came in 331 BC at the Battle of Gaugamela, today's northern Iraq. Darius III again raised a massive army, including infantry, cavalry, and war elephants, to stop Alexander's advance. But Alexander used his tactical brilliance, a flexible order of battle, and targeted maneuvers to crush the Persian army. Darius fled again, and the backbone of the Achaemenid king was badly damaged. The conquest of Egypt in 332 BC was another strategic milestone. Without major fighting, Alexander took control of the country and was recognized as pharaoh. In Egypt, he founded Alexandria, which was to become a cultural, economic, and scientific center of antiquity. The population welcomed Alexander as a liberator because he respected the existing structures and tolerated religious and local traditions. The decisive blow against the Achaemenid Empire came in 331 BC at the Battle of Gaugamela, today's northern Iraq. Darius III again raised a massive army, including infantry, cavalry, and war elephants, to stop Alexander's advance. But Alexander used his tactical brilliance, a flexible order of battle, and targeted maneuvers to crush the Persian army. Darius fled again, and the backbone of the Achaemenid Empire broke. After Gaugamela, Alexander began the systematic conquest of the rest of Persian territory. Babylon, one of the most magnificent cities of the empire, fell without resistance, and Alexander integrated it as an administrative center. Susa and Persepolis were captured, with Persepolis partly destroyed, partly out of symbolic revenge for past conflicts, partly for strategic reasons. With the fall of these cities, the Achaemenid Empire ceased to exist as a political entity. Darius III was eventually assassinated by one of his own satraps, marking the end of the dynastic lineage. Alexander took over not only the territorial territories of Persia, but also the administrative and cultural heritage. He largely preserved the administrative units, satrapies, and local elites, but combined them with Macedonian control. In this way, he was able to facilitate the integration of the population and stability in the conquered regions. Alexander's conquest of Persia had profound consequences. Politically, the Achaemenid dynasty ended, and the power vacuum led to new systems of rule under the Diadochi, Alexander's generals. Culturally, Alexander relied on Hellenization, which spread Greek culture, administration, architecture, and language, but at the same time respected Persian traditions. This synthesis led to the formation of a new cultural space that connected Persia and Greece and laid the foundation for the Hellenistic empires. Militarily, the fall of Persia demonstrated the limits of a vast, multi-ethnic empire that relied heavily on satraps, local troops, and loyalty. The Achaemenid Empire could not withstand Alexander's flexibility, mobility, and tactics, although it was superior in organization, administration, and resources. In summary, Alexander's conquest marks the endpoint of the Achaemenid Empire. Under Cyrus and Darius, Persia had become a stable empire for centuries for the first time.
But the combination of internal fragmentation, military overextension, and an extraordinarily talented opponent led to its downfall. Nevertheless, the cultural and administrative legacy of the Achaemenids survived. Administrative systems, religious tolerance, and infrastructure influenced the subsequent Hellenistic empires and shaped the Persian identity for centuries.
Chapter 7. The Seleucids and the Hellenistic Period. After the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, his empire fell into the hands of his generals, who became known as the Diadochi. In Persia, the Seleucid dynasty was established, named after Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander's generals, who controlled large parts of the former Achaemenid Empire. This period, known as the Hellenistic period, was characterized by a mixture of Greek and Persian traditions and left a profound mark on the politics, culture, and economy of the region. Seleucus I had the difficult task of stabilizing a vast territory that stretched from Anatolia to the Indus. The administration of the Achaemenid Empire, which had already been developed under Cyrus and Darius, provided a valuable basis for this. Seleucus retained the satrapy structure, but appointed Greek governors, military, and administrative officials to ensure loyalty to his dynasty. This hybrid administration allowed for both local autonomy and central control, a crucial factor for stability in a multi-ethnic empire. Politically, Seleucid rule was characterized by military power and dynastic control. The empire was constantly confronted with uprisings by local rulers and conflicts with neighboring Hellenistic states, such as Egypt under the Ptolemies. Seleucus and his successors therefore had to maintain a strong army, consisting of both Greek mercenaries and locally recruited troops. The military presence served not only to suppress insurgencies, but also to secure trade routes and strategically important cities. Culturally, this period marked the Hellenization of Persia. Greek architecture, art, and language were introduced to administrative centers in cities such as Antioch, Seleucia on Tigris, and Ecbatana. Temples, theaters, schools, and public squares based on the Greek model shaped urban life. At the same time, local Persian traditions remained, resulting in a cultural synthesis. Greek elements were adopted without completely displacing Persian identity. The Seleucids also promoted trade and economic networking. Persia's location on important trade routes, which stretched from Mesopotamia through Central Asia to the Indus, enabled a flourishing exchange of goods, knowledge, and technologies. Cities such as Susa, Babylon, and Persepolis developed into centers of business, administration, and cultural life. The introduction of Greek coins and measures facilitated trade and contributed to the economic integration of the empire. Religion also played a central role in the Seleucid period. The rulers pursued a pragmatic policy. While supporting Greek cults, they continued to respect Persian and local religions. Zoroastrian, Babylonian, and Egyptian deities were worshipped in local temples, while Greek deities were introduced through new temples and public rituals. This tolerance contributed to stability and facilitated the administration of such a diverse empire. Despite these successes, the Seleucid Empire was unstable. The enormous expansion of the territory, the constant threat of internal uprisings and external rivals led to fragmentation and weakening. Areas such as Bactrium, Media, and Persis effectively detached themselves from the central power over time. The Seleucids had to concentrate increasingly on core areas, which gradually reduced their political and military control over the entire former Achaemenid lands. The Hellenistic period shaped Persia in the long term. The fusion of Greek and Persian culture gave rise to new forms of art, architecture, administration, and urban planning. Trade networks in cities continued to develop, while military and administrative concepts of the Achaemenid Empire were continued and adapted to the new challenges. The Hellenistic rulers relied on a flexible approach. Military power, cultural integration, and political pragmatism were crucial to stabilize a heterogeneous empire. In summary, the Seleucid period in Persia represented both a continuation and a transformation of the Achaemenid traditions. Military organization, administration, and infrastructure remained, but were supplemented with Greek elements.
Culturally, a new synthesis emerged, which not only brought Persia formative art, architecture, and education, but also laid the foundation for later empires, including the Parthians and Sassanids. Despite political instability and territorial losses, this period represented a decisive phase in Persian history, in which Greek and Persian elements merged permanently.
Chapter 8. The Parthians, Resurgence of Persian Power. After the gradual collapse of the Seleucid Empire in the 2nd century BC, a new power emerged in Persia, the Parthians, an Iranian nomadic people who originally came from the region north of the Caspian Sea and Central Asia. Under the leadership of the Arsacid dynasty, the Parthians succeeded in reuniting Persia, taking control of important trade routes and establishing themselves as a major great power between Rome and Central Asia. The founding of the Parthian Empire is traditionally associated with Arsaces I, ca. 247 BC. Taking advantage of the weakness of the Seleucid Empire, weakened by internal power struggles and local uprisings, Arsaces founded an independent Persian empire. Initially, the rule of the Parthians was limited regionally, but they were able to expand quickly through clever military tactics and political alliances. Particularly important was the control of Mesopotamia and Persis, the core areas of the Achaemenid Empire, as well as the takeover of strategically important cities and trade routes. The military organization of the Parthians was characteristic of their nomadic origins. The Parthians relied on cavalry, especially mounted archers, who were famous for their agility and precision. These troops were able to carry out rapid attacks, retreat when necessary, and wear down the often numerically superior opponents through guerrilla tactics and raid maneuvers. The cavalry was supplemented by local infantry units that defended cities and ensured the occupation of central points. Politically, the Parthians were characterized by decentralized rule. The Arsacids installed local rulers in the provinces, who were under the central control of the king but were able to act relatively autonomously. This system was similar to the satrapies of the Achaemenid Empire, but was more focused on the military needs and mobility of the Parthian cavalry. In this way, the Parthians were able to control a large heterogeneous area efficiently without overloading central structures. The Parthians also benefited from the economic importance of the Silk Road. They controlled the trade routes between China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Mediterranean. By securing these routes, they were able to collect trade, tributes, and taxes, which boosted the empire's wealth and financed military expansion. Cities such as Hecatompylos, Seleucia on the Tigris, and Ctesiphon became important political, economic, and cultural centers. Culturally, the Parthians relied on a mixture of Persian and Hellenistic traditions. While adopting the administration, architecture, and some cultural forms of the Seleucids, they also strengthened the traditional Iranian identity. In art and architecture, Hellenistic influences can be seen in the design of temples and palaces, as well as elements from the Persian Achaemenid period, especially in reliefs, tombs, and coins. The Parthians were in constant conflict with Rome, which was expanding to the west and seeking control of Asia Minor and the eastern Mediterranean. Several wars between the Parthians and the Romans, including the famous battles of Caria, 53 BC, and Edessa, demonstrated the military strength of the Parthians and their ability to contain Roman expansion. Despite temporary setbacks, the Parthians managed to hold on to their core territories and stabilize the empire for several centuries. Religion played an important role in the Parthian Empire. Zoroastrianism remained the dominant religion, but the empire continued to be religiously pluralistic. Local cults, Babylonian, Mesopotamian, and later Christian communities were tolerated. This religious tolerance contributed to social stability and facilitated the integration of the numerous peoples who were under Parthian rule. The Parthians established a long-term sustainable empire that shaped Persia for more than 4 centuries. They adopted and adapted many of the administrative and military concepts of the Achaemenids and Seleucids, but integrated their own nomadic traditions and military strategies. This created a flexible, resilient system that could withstand both internal insurgencies and external threats. In summary, it can be said that the Parthians made it possible for Persia to rise again after the Hellenistic period. They established an empire that combined military strength, political flexibility, economic control, and cultural integration. Their success was based on the combination of nomadic mobility, central control, and cultural adaptability. The Parthian Empire laid the foundation for the later Sassanid rule and once again consolidated Persia as an important great power in the Middle East. Chapter 9. Culture, Trade, and Military of the Parthians. The Parthians, who took control of Persia in the 3rd century BC, not only established a politically stable empire, but also shaped the cultural, economic, and military landscape of the region. Their empire stretched from Mesopotamia to Central Asia and was a decisive player between East and West. The Parthians' ability to integrate cultural diversity, control trade networks, and deploy a mobile war machine made them a great power whose influence shaped Persia for several centuries. Militarily, the Parthians relied on their famous cavalry, especially mounted archers, who were considered unsurpassed in antiquity. These troops were easily mobile, could attack quickly and retreat just as quickly, often wearing down numerically superior opponents. The Parthians combined this mobile cavalry with infantry units defending strategically important cities, developing a flexible and adaptable military system that was effective against both Roman legions and rebellious tribal groups. The cities of the Parthian Empire were both political and economic centers. Ctesiphon, located on the eastern border of the Tigris, became the capital and symbolic power base of the Sassanids. It served as an administrative center, military base, and trading hub. Other cities, such as Hecatompylos or Seleucia, remained important hubs for trade and culture. The Parthians invested in infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and fortified cities to secure their military presence and ensure communications throughout the empire. Trade played a central role in the stability and prosperity of the Parthians. The empire controlled parts of the Silk Road, which connected China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Mediterranean. This control allowed the Parthians not only to levy taxes and customs duties, but also to promote cultural exchange. Merchants, travelers, and scholars moved across the empire, resulting in a mixing of ideas, technologies, and religions. Luxury goods such as silk, spices, and precious stones flowed west via Parthian territory, while knowledge from India and Central Asia reached Persia. Culturally, the Parthians were multicultural and tolerant. They preserved many traditions of the Achaemenid Empire, but also adopted Hellenistic elements of the previous Seleucid rule. In art and architecture, influences from Greece, Mesopotamia, and Central Asia can be seen. Reliefs, coins, and palaces show a mixture of Persian motifs and Greek aesthetics. This cultural synthesis was not only an expression of power, but also a tool for the integration of different peoples within the empire. The Parthians also promoted local religions and cults. Zoroastrianism remained central, but at the same time other religions were tolerated. Babylonian, Mesopotamian, Jewish, and later Christian communities were able to continue to practice their customs. This religious policy strengthened loyalty and contributed to the stability of the empire. The conflicts with Rome shaped the Parthian military strategy. Battles such as that of Carrhae in 53 BC showed the effectiveness of the Parthian cavalry against Roman legions. Through clever guerrilla tactics, quick raids, and the use of the terrain, the Parthians were able to wear down even numerically superior enemies. This military efficiency made the empire a serious opponent for Rome, which influenced the balance of power in the Middle East for centuries. On an economic level, the Parthians secured internal trade and promoted the production of agricultural products, textiles, and handicrafts. Fertile regions such as Media, Persia, and Mesopotamia provided food and raw materials, while the cities functioned as trading centers. The Parthians used both local markets and international trade networks to secure wealth and stability.
The Parthians thus combined military strength, cultural integration, and economic control to maintain an empire that remained stable despite external threats and internal diversity. Their rule showed that political flexibility, military adaptation, and cultural tolerance were crucial to sustaining a large, multi-ethnic empire for centuries. In summary, it can be said that the Parthians made a decisive contribution to the continuity of Persian history. They created an empire that combined military innovation, cultural synthesis, and economic networking. The Parthian Empire laid the foundations for the later Sassanid rule and showed how Persia could once again become a stable and powerful great power after the Hellenistic period.
Chapter 10. The Sassanids, Restoration of a Persian Empire. After centuries of Parthian rule, Persia experienced a renaissance as a political and cultural great power in the 3rd century AD under the Sassanids. Founded by Ardashir I around 224 AD, the Sassanids restored the Persian monarchy and adopted both territorial and administrative structures based on the Achaemenids and Parthians. This empire developed into one of the most powerful and influential empires of the ancient world, which shaped the political, military, cultural, and religious landscape of Persia for centuries. Ardashir I began his reign after the defeat of the Parthians and united Persia under a centralized dynasty. Unlike the Parthians, he strove for stronger central control, adopting the Parthian satrapy structure but ensuring loyalty through close ties to the king and strong bureaucratic control. This allowed the Sassanid Empire to be governed more uniformly, and political fragmentation was reduced. The military organization of the Sassanids was highly developed and versatile. The army relied on heavy cavalry, the so-called cataphracts, which were armored and equipped with lances. These elite units were supplemented by mounted archers, infantry, and specialized troops for sieges. The Sassanids also built fortresses and border fortifications, especially on the border with Rome and in the east against nomadic tribes. This combination of offensive power and defensive stability made the Sassanid Empire one of the most dangerous opponents of the Roman Empire. The wars against Rome and later the Byzantine Empire had a decisive influence on Sassanid rule. Battles such as the conquest of Antioch and Ctesiphon, the sieges of Constantinople, and the control of Armenia showed the military power of the Sassanids. At the same time, this permanent confrontation led to a strong military and administrative structure that kept the empire stable for centuries. Culturally and religiously, the Sassanids played on the continuity of Iranian traditions. Zoroastrianism became the state religion and central to the legitimacy of the monarchy. Fire sanctuaries, temples, and religious ceremonies strengthened the king's political aspirations and promoted the unity of the empire. Nevertheless, religious minorities such as Jews, Christians, and later Buddhists remained tolerated in order to ensure loyalty in the various provinces. The Sassanids also promoted art, architecture, and science. Cities such as Ctesiphon, Persepolis as a cultural symbol, and Gundashapur became centers of administration, education, and trade. The architecture was characterized by monumental palaces, fortresses, and bridges, while artistic works integrated both local Persian traditions and influences from Mesopotamia and India. This cultural flourishing was an expression of the power and stability of the empire and had a lasting influence on the region. Economically, the Sassanid Empire benefited from its strategic location on the Silk Road. Trade with China, India, Arabia, and the Mediterranean region brought wealth and stabilized rule. Cities became trading centers, markets flourished, and the exchange of luxury goods such as silk, spices, and precious stones was intense. This economic networking not only strengthened royal authority, but also contributed to the integration of the diverse ethnic groups. The administration of the Sassanids was highly centralized, with local governors still enjoying some autonomy, but reporting directly to the king. The bureaucracy was professionalized, taxes were standardized, and jurisdiction was standardized. Through the combination of central control, a strong military presence, and economic stability, the Sassanid Empire was able to exist for over 4 centuries and act as a counterpoint to the Roman Byzantine Empire. The Sassanid period thus marked the restoration and consolidation of Persian power. They combined the best elements of the Achaemenid administration, the military tradition of the Parthians, and the cultural synthesis of the Hellenistic period. Military efficiency, religious legitimacy, economic control, and cultural promotion made the Sassanid Empire one of the longest-lived and most influential empires of antiquity. In summary, the Sassanids led Persia into a period of political stability, military strength, and cultural flourishing. They established an empire that was both internally consolidated and effective externally as a counterweight to Rome and later Byzantium. The legacy of the Sassanids still shapes Persia in its religious tradition, culture, and political identity.
Chapter 11: Religion, Administration, and Society under the Sassanids. The Sassanid rule, 224 to 651 AD, represented a decisive phase in Persian history, in which political power, religious identity, and social structures were closely intertwined. Under the Arsacid succession, the Sassanid dynasty created a central power that was not only militarily strong, but also culturally and religiously stabilizing. The interplay of religion, administration, and society shaped Persia for several centuries and laid the foundation for the later Islamic era. Religion, especially Zoroastrianism, formed the backbone of Sassanid rule. The monarchs presented themselves as representatives of Ahura Mazda on earth, which underpinned their political legitimacy. Fire sanctuaries, temple ceremonies, and the cult of holy scriptures such as the Avesta strengthened the connection between king and religion. The Zoroastrian doctrine not only influenced rituals and everyday life, but also shaped the legal order and moral framework of the empire. The king was both religious and political leader, a symbiosis that stabilized the empire. The administration of the Sassanids was highly centralized and structured. The empire was divided into provinces, which were led by governors, so-called shaharabs. These governors were responsible for tax revenue, justice, and military defense, but were in direct contact with the king. The system allowed for both effective control and regional autonomy, which helped to curb insurgencies and local power struggles. This system was complemented by a well-organized bureaucracy that collected taxes, supervised public works projects, and regulated trade activities. Society under the Sassanids was strictly hierarchical, but dynamically and functionally organized. At the top was the king, followed by nobles, priesthood, military elite, and urban bourgeoisie. Peasants, artisans, and merchants formed the economic base, while slaves and subordinate groups performed the work necessary for the functioning of large cities and agricultural production. The social structure was strongly influenced by the Zoroastrian faith, which propagated morality, loyalty, and a sense of duty as central values. The legal system was closely linked to religion and royal power. Zoroastrian principles such as truth, justice, and loyalty determined the legal system. Judicial decisions were based not only on secular laws, but also on moral and religious norms. This combination of law and religion strengthened the king's central authority and ensured social stability, as the population respected religiously legitimized rules. The Sassanids also promoted culture, education, and science. Cities such as Ctesiphon, Gundishapur, and Persepolis became cultural centers where philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and literature flourished. The academic center in Gundishapur became especially famous for its medical school, which integrated Greek, Indian, and Persian knowledge. This cultural flourishing not only strengthened the identity of the empire, but also facilitated administration and diplomacy, as educated officials and scholars were able to perform complex state tasks. The economy played a crucial role in the stability of society. Agriculture, trade, and crafts were promoted, with the empire benefiting from its strategic location between India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. Control of the Silk Road and other trade routes secured revenues, brought prosperity to the cities, and supported military and administrative structures. Through taxes, customs duties, and tribute payments, the Sassanids were able to finance their army and carry out infrastructure projects. The military organization was closely linked to society and administration. The army, consisting of cataphracts, mounted archers, and infantry, was supported by a system of feudal systems and regional recruitment. At the same time, the military elite was part of the social structure and had a significant influence on politics and administration. This ensured both the loyalty of the troops and the stability of the rule. The Sassanids thus combined religion, administration, and social structures into a coherent system. The king as religious and political leader, a centralized administration, a stable legal system, and a hierarchical functional society made it possible to control a vast multi-ethnic empire. At the same time, they promoted culture, trade, and science, which contributed to internal consolidation. In summary, the Sassanids not only consolidated political and military power, but also established a social order and cultural identity that shaped Persia for centuries. Religion and administration were used strategically to secure loyalty, prevent conflict, and preserve the empire as a unit. These structures formed the foundation for the stability of the Sassanid Empire and left a lasting legacy that continued to have an effect in the Islamic period of Persia.
Chapter 12. Wars with Byzantium and Central Asia. The Sassanid rule of Persia was not only a period of internal stability and cultural flourishing, but also a time of intense military conflicts. In particular, the confrontations with Byzantium in the west and the conflicts with Central Asian nomadic tribes in the east shaped the political, military, and economic history of the empire. These wars not only demanded military skill, but also had a lasting influence on the administration, society, and cultural development of Persia. The conflict with Byzantium, the heir to the Roman Empire in the east, began under the early Sassanids. The claim to control of Mesopotamia, Armenia, and parts of the Caucasus led to repeated military conflicts. The Sassanids considered these regions to be the traditional heartlands of Persia, while Byzantium wanted to secure its eastern borders. This led to a permanent state of military tension that lasted for several centuries. The Sassanids developed a highly developed border defense for this purpose. Fortresses, fortified cities, and strategic garrisons were built along the Byzantine border to repel attacks at an early stage. At the same time, mobile units, especially the mounted cavalry, enabled rapid counterattacks and the conduct of campaigns. This military flexibility was crucial to successfully coordinate both offensive and defensive operations. An example of the conflicts is the siege of Amida under Emperor Khosrau I, in which Persian troops attacked the fortified Byzantine city to gain control of Mesopotamia. These conflicts were not only military enterprises, but also had political and economic motives. Control of trade routes, income from tributes, and strategic dominance were at the heart of Sassanid expansion. Parallel to the fighting in the west, the Sassanids also waged wars in the east, especially against nomadic tribes and kingdoms of Central Asia, such as the Hephthalites, also known as the White Huns. These regions were economically and strategically important to Persia as they controlled trade routes to India and China. The Sassanids relied on a combination of diplomacy, military, and trade relations to secure these territories. Successful campaigns led to a stabilization of the eastern borders and allowed Persia to retain control of the lucrative Silk Road routes. The military conflicts also had an economic dimension. Warfare required significant resources, especially for recruiting and supplying the army, building fortresses, and logistics. At the same time, the military success secured access to trade routes and sources of income that stabilized the empire financially.
Cities along the borders were developed into military and economic hubs, promoting trade, administration, and cultural exchange. Culturally, the wars had a significant impact on the Sassanids. Military successes strengthened the king's legitimacy and fostered pride in the Persian heritage. They led to the promotion of art and architecture that symbolized the king's power, including triumphal arches, reliefs, and monuments documenting victorious campaigns. At the same time, contact with Byzantium, Armenia, and Central Asia influenced Persian art, science, and religion, developing a dynamic cultural synthesis. Socially, the constant wars led to a militarization of the elite. Nobles and officials were often directly involved in military operations, while the population, especially farmers and craftsmen, provided the logistic and material foundations for warfare. This close connection between the military, administration, and society was characteristic of the Sassanid Empire and made a decisive contribution to the stability of the state. The wars with Byzantium reached climaxes several times, including the conquest of parts of Syria, Armenia, and Mesopotamia. But the fronts shifted again and again, as Byzantium also had considerable military resources. The fighting led to a lasting balance of power, which shaped the political and military thinking of both empires. At the same time, they sharpened the strategic capabilities of the Sassanids and consolidated their military tradition. In summary, the military conflicts with Byzantium and Central Asia were a decisive factor in the stability, organization, and expansion of the Sassanid Empire. They challenged the army, strengthened the administration, influenced trade and infrastructure, and shaped society. The Sassanids' ability to manage these conflicts made Persia a regional superpower for centuries and prepared the ground for the cultural and political flourishing of the empire that it would maintain until the Islamic conquest.
Chapter 13: The Fall of the Sassanid Empire and the Islamic Conquest. The Sassanid Empire, which had shaped Persia as a politically, culturally, and militarily dominant power since the 3rd century AD, was facing a profound change in the 7th century AD. The centuries-long conflict with Byzantium, internal power struggles, and economic burdens had weakened the empire. At the same time, a new dynamic power emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, the Muslim Arabs, whose expansion ushered in the end of Sassanid rule. At the beginning of the 7th century, the Sassanid Empire was militarily and politically unstable. Emperor Khosrow II had undertaken successful campaigns against Byzantium, among other things, but these wars exhausted the resources of the empire. The economy was burdened by long campaigns, taxes and duties had placed a heavy burden on the population, and uprisings in the provinces increased. At the same time, the dynasty was weakened by internal power struggles, the loyalty of the local governors was uncertain, and the administration was overstretched. In this situation, the new power from Arabia emerged, the Muslims, under the leadership of the Rashidun caliphs after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD. The Arabs combined political, religious, and military forces, creating a highly motivated, flexible army specialized in both rapid cavalry assaults and coordinated sieges. The combination of religious zeal, mobility, and strategy posed a challenge to the traditional, cumbersome Sassanid army. The first conflicts began in the border regions of Persia, especially in Mesopotamia. The Arabs were able to isolate smaller Sassanid units through rapid advances and targeted attacks. The Sassanid army, whose strength traditionally lay in heavy cataphracts and fixed garrisons, was not optimally prepared for these mobile attacks. Several battles, including the decisive Battle of Qadisiyah in 636 AD, led to crushing defeats for the Sassanids. These defeats weakened the king's authority and led to a rapid decline in military morale. The Arab troops used not only military tactics, but also diplomatic strategies to win over local populations. Cities and regions that suffered under Sassanid rule found in Muslim expansion an opportunity to relieve themselves from high taxes, central control, or religious oppression. This facilitated the conquest of large territories, as the Muslims were often perceived as liberators and received local support.
The decisive phase of the downfall began with the siege of Ctesiphon, the capital of the Sassanids. The city, once a symbol of power, administration, and culture, fell into the hands of the Arabs in 637 AD. The fall of Ctesiphon meant not only the loss of the administrative center, but also a deep psychological blow to the Sassanid dynasty. Emperor Yazdegerd III, the last Sassanid ruler, fled to the east but was no longer able to organize effective resistance. The Islamic conquest led to a radical political and religious transformation. The Zoroastrian state was replaced, local elites were integrated or replaced in the new system, and the administration was adapted to the structures of the new caliphs. The Arabic language and Islam became increasingly widespread, with existing cultural traditions and sciences continuing in a synthesis with the new order. The conquest of Persia marked the end of the Sassanids as a political power, but their cultural and administrative legacy remained. Administrative structures, urban organization, trade networks, and military strategies of the Sassanids had a significant influence on subsequent Islamic rule. Cities like Gundashapur remained scientific centers, and Zoroastrian traditions survived in remote regions. In summary, the fall of the Sassanid Empire was a combination of internal weakening, external military threat, and strategic flexibility on the part of the attackers. The Islamic conquest of Persia ended a great empire that had lasted 4 centuries, but at the same time ushered in a new epoch in which Persian culture, administration, and science continued to live under Islamic rule and decisively shaped the development of the Middle East. The destruction of the old structures through military defeats, the integration of local elites, and the introduction of a new religion and administration marked not only the end of an empire, but also the beginning of a new Persian identity that would evolve over the centuries to come, eventually forming the basis for medieval and modern Persia.
Chapter 14. The Early Islamic Period, Caliphates and Integration of Persia. After the fall of the Sassanid Empire in the 7th century AD, a new epoch began for Persia, the Early Islamic Period. The Arab conquerors, who operated under the Rashidun and later Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs, established new political structures and introduced Islam as the dominant religion. At the same time, Persia remained a center of cultural, scientific, and economic activity, integrating with the new rulers and retaining its own regional characteristics. The first decades after the conquest were marked by political adaptation and integration. The Arab caliphs established administrative structures, some of which were based on the existing Sassanid systems, including provincial divisions, tax systems, and military organization. Local elites, especially civil servants and nobles, were often involved in the new administration to ensure stability and reassure the population. This pragmatic integration facilitated the transition to Arab rule and made Persia an important part of the early caliphate. Religiously, the conquest brought Islam to Persia as the central state religion. While large parts of the population embraced the new faith, the Zoroastrian religion initially remained present, especially in rural areas and remote regions. This dual religious landscape led to a gradual Islamization that lasted for several centuries without completely destroying the cultural and linguistic identity of Persia. Islam increasingly became the basis of jurisprudence, administration, and social order, while Persian traditions were preserved in architecture, literature, and science. Politically, the early Islamic period was characterized by caliphates who came from Arabia. The Rashidun caliphs, 632 to 661, laid the foundations, while the Umayyads, 661 to 750, centralized the administration and spread Arabic culture and language among the bureaucracy. Under the Abbasids, 750 to 1258, Persia experienced a heyday in science, culture, and business. Cities like Baghdad, which was based on Sassanid ideas, became centers of administration, trade, and education. Many Persians, including scholars, officials, and merchants, played a crucial role in the administration and contributed to the stability and prosperity of the caliphate. A decisive factor was the integration of the Persian bureaucracy and culture. Many administrative practices already established under the Sassanids were adopted, including tax systems, provincial administration, and documentation. Persian officials helped to support the new Arab rulers with knowledge of local conditions, economy, and infrastructure. This led to a hybrid administration that combined Arab and Persian elements and incorporated Persia into the caliphate without completely destroying local structures. The economic situation of Persia stabilized under the caliphs through trade, agriculture, and crafts. Persia benefited from its strategic location on the Silk Road and other trade routes connecting China, Central Asia, India, and the Mediterranean. Cities such as Isfahan, Nishapur, and Ray developed into centers of trade and crafts that both increased local prosperity and financially strengthened the caliphate. Culturally, a synthesis of Persian tradition and Islamic culture prevailed. The Persian language remained widely used in everyday life, while Arabic dominated as an administrative language and for religious texts. Science, medicine, astronomy, and literature benefited from the combination of both traditions. Persian scholars played a leading role in the schools of Baghdad and Gundashapur, contributed to the translation of Greek and Indian works, and had a decisive influence on Islamic civilization. Socially, Persia changed under Arab rule but remained strongly hierarchically structured. The elite consisted of Arab governors, Persian officials, and wealthy merchants, while farmers and artisans formed the economic base. New social opportunities arose through education, religious conversion, and administrative positions that allowed Persians to gain influence within the caliphate. The early Islamic period of Persia shows that military conquest, political integration, and cultural synthesis worked simultaneously. Although the Sassanid Empire collapsed, Persia was able to preserve and develop its political, economic, and cultural importance. The combination of Arab rule and Persian tradition led to a stability that lasted for several centuries and laid the foundation for the later dynasties that shaped medieval Persia. In summary, the early Islamic period of Persia was a phase of transformation and adaptation. It marked the end of the Sassanid Empire, introduced Islam, integrated Persia into the political and economic structures of the caliphates, and laid the foundation for a cultural flowering that combined Persian identity, science, and art with the new Arab and Islamic order. Chapter 15: The Seljuks and the Heyday of Persian Culture. After the early Islamic period and the consolidation of Persia under the Caliphates, a new power appeared on the scene in the 11th century, the Seljuks, a Turco-Mongol people who came from Central Asia and established themselves in Persia under the leadership of Tughril Beg. Combining military strength with political pragmatism, the Seljuks promoted trade, science, and culture, and led Persia into a period of cultural flourishing unparalleled in the Islamic world. The Seljuks took advantage of the weakness of the Abbasid caliphs and the fragmentation of regional rulers to secure their control over Persia. Tughril Beg and his successors established a decentralized rule in which local emirs and governors acted largely autonomously, but at the same time remained obliged to pay tribute to the sultan's court in Nishapur or Isfahan. This structure was similar to the satrapies of the ancient Achaemenids, but was more focused on the military efficiency and loyalty of Turco-Mongol warriors. Militarily, the Seljuks were characterized by a highly mobile cavalry that was superior both in the steppes of Central Asia and in the plains of Persia. Mounted archers, light cavalry units, and elite warriors formed the backbone of the army. These troops enabled rapid campaigns, effective border defense, and the enforcement of Seljuk rule over vast and heterogeneous areas. They were particularly effective against local uprisings, rival dynasties, and against the Crusaders who advanced into the Middle East from the late 11th century onwards. Under the rule of the Seljuks, Persia experienced an economic boom. Control of the ancient trade routes, especially the Silk Road and routes to India and Mesopotamia, allowed for extensive trade in goods, luxury goods, and technologies. Cities such as Isfahan, Nishapur, Ray, and Merv developed into centers of trade, crafts, and finance. This economic stability not only contributed to the power of the Seljuks, but also promoted cultural activities and scientific developments. Culturally, the Seljuk period marked a heyday of Persian culture. Despite the Turco-Mongol rulers, the Persian language, literature, and administration remained dominant. Poets, scholars, and philosophers were promoted, and Persian schools developed into centers of science and education. Works in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were created or developed from earlier traditions, making Persia once again an intellectual center of the Islamic world. The Seljuks also promoted Islamic architecture. Mosques, madrasas, educational institutions, palaces, and caravanserais were built in large numbers. The city of Isfahan in particular, which was expanded under the Grand Sultans of the 11th and 12th centuries, is considered a prime example of Seljuk architecture. These buildings combined Persian traditions, Islamic architectural principles, and artistic innovations, and became the model for later dynasties, including the Safavids. Religiously, the Seljuks relied on Sunni Islam, especially on the promotion of the Shiite minority perspective under strict control. Madrasas were established to standardize religious and legal education, and scholars were involved to legitimize rule. At the same time, other religious traditions persisted in remote regions, facilitating the stability of the multi-ethnic and multi-religious population. The Seljuks were also a decisive factor in defending the Islamic world against the Crusaders, who invaded the Middle East from 1096 onwards. Combining strategic mobility, fortified cities, and diplomatic skill, the Seljuks were able to maintain control of key routes and cities and limit the influence of the Crusader states. In summary, the Seljuks led Persia into a period of political stability, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing. Military strength, efficient administration, economic control, and the promotion of science and culture made the empire a central player in the Islamic world. The Seljuk dynasty not only secured the Persian identity, but also laid the foundations for later cultural and political developments in Persia.
Chapter 16. The Mongol Empire and the Timurids, Destruction and Reconstruction. The Seljuk heyday of Persia ended in the 13th century with the invasion of the Mongols under Genghis Khan and his successors. The Mongol conquests led to massive destruction, the collapse of political structures, and a deep social crisis. At the same time, this phase marked the beginning of a long process of reconstruction and cultural synthesis that eventually led to the renewed flowering of Persia under the Timurids. The Mongols, originally nomadic equestrian tribes from the Central Asian steppe, carried out their conquests with extreme speed and military brutality. Their armies consisted of highly mobile cavalry units that used both mounted archers and heavy cavalry combinations. The battles against the Seljuks and other regional rulers were often destructive. Cities were besieged, populations were massacred, and entire regions were depopulated. The Mongol strategy was aimed at breaking resistance and building a large-scale empire that stretched from China to the Caspian Sea. A decisive event was the conquest of Baghdad in 1258, which marked the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate and radically changed the political landscape in the Middle East. For Persia, these conquests meant the collapse of existing power structures, the destruction of trading centers, and a severe economic crisis. Many urban centers, including Isfahan, Ray, and Nishapur, were looted or destroyed, and the population suffered massive losses. Despite the destruction, Mongol rule also led to a new political order. The Mongols established provincial administrations under their commanders, which integrated local elites to a limited extent. Under the Ilkhan dynasty, which controlled Persia, existing administrative structures such as tax systems and city hierarchies were largely adopted. This pragmatic integration facilitated the administration of a vast multi-ethnic empire and laid the foundation for reconstruction after the initial devastation. Culturally, Mongol rule led to a mixture of Persian, Central Asian, and Chinese traditions. Although many cities were destroyed, scholars, artists, and craftsmen survived in the remaining urban centers. The integration of knowledge and art techniques from Central Asia and China enriched Persian culture and led to a synthesis that was to reach its full bloom under the Timurids. Economically, the focus was initially on stabilizing agriculture and securing trade routes. The Mongols used Persia as a link between East Asia and the Middle East, reviving trade and transportation of goods such as silk, spices, and gemstones. Cities rebuilt after the destruction benefited from trade along the ancient Silk Road, and new caravan routes reconnected Persia with Central Asia and India. The Timurids, who advanced into Persia from Central Asia in the late 14th century, continued the reconstruction. Timur, Tamerlane, used the military might of his army to secure control of Persia while initiating major construction projects in cities such as Samarkand and Herat. Under his rule and that of his successors, a new cultural center was created that promoted architecture, science, literature, and art. Persian miniature painting, carpet art, and book illumination in particular experienced a heyday. Religiously, the Mongols and Timurids adapted to the population. The majority of the population was Muslim, and both Sunni and Shiite traditions were respected. The rulers used religious institutions to ensure loyalty and supported the establishment of madrasas, mosques, and libraries that promoted cultural reconstruction and intellectual development. In summary, the Mongol invasion initially destroyed Persia, weakened political power, and caused great social and economic losses. At the same time, it initiated a long-term process of integration, cultural synthesis, and reconstruction which reached its peak under the Timurids. Military strength, pragmatic administration, and cultural openness enabled Persia to once again become a center of power, trade, and culture after destruction. The Mongol and Timurid phase shows that Persia always had the ability to reconstruct political order, economic stability, and cultural flourishing despite external destruction. This resilience laid the foundation for the later Safavid rule and the development of the Persian state in the early modern period.
Chapter 17. Safavids, Rise of Shiite Persia. In the early 16th century, a new dynasty came to power in Persia, the Safavids, founded by Ismail I. The Safavids initiated a profound transformation of Persia which had a lasting impact on the country politically, religiously, and culturally. Their rise marked not only the reunification of Persia after centuries of fragmentation, but also the introduction of 12 Shiite Islam as the state religion, which cemented Persia's religious identity for centuries. Ismail I managed to gain control of most of Persia through military strength, charismatic leadership, and the support of loyal clans. The Safavids built on the political structures of the Timurids, but centralized the administration more strongly in order to ensure stable rule over the heterogeneous empire. The capital was first established in Tabriz, later moved to Isfahan, which was expanded into one of the most magnificent centers in the world under Shah Abbas I. A decisive feature of Safavid rule was religious policy. Ismail I declared 12 Shiite Islam to be the state religion and carried out a comprehensive Islamization of the administration, the legal system, and society. Shiite clerics were integrated into the administration, madrasas were built, and religious institutions were promoted to strengthen the dynasty's legitimacy. This religious unification clearly distinguished Persia from the Sunni-dominated neighboring empires, especially the Ottoman Empire, and created a new, enduring religious identity. Militarily, the Safavids relied on the combination of elite mounted regiments, Kizilbash, and regular troops. The Kizilbash, originally tribal associations loyal to the dynasty, played a central role in consolidating power, in campaigns against rival local rulers, and in conflicts with the Ottomans and Uzbeks. The military structure was closely linked to the political and religious organization. Loyalty to the Shah and Shiitism was linked to military power and social status. The Safavids systematically promoted the economy and trade. Isfahan, Tabriz, Qazwin, and Shiraz were developed into important trade and craft centers. Control of key trade routes, including parts of the Silk Road, brought prosperity and made it possible to finance military campaigns, construction projects, and cultural institutions. Caravanserais, markets, and new trade infrastructures facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between East and West. Culturally, Persia experienced a renaissance of arts and architecture under the Safavids. Especially under Shah Abbas I, monumental palaces, mosques, and public buildings were built in Isfahan, which are still considered masterpieces of Persian architecture today. The Safavids promoted miniature painting, carpet art, calligraphy, and literature. Scholars and artists were brought to courts, making Persia once again a center of science, art, and education in the Islamic world. The Safavids also consolidated the administration through the introduction of central authorities, tax systems, and regional governors who reported directly to the king. This system combined central control with local autonomy, similar to previous Persian empires, but more centralized and geared to the interests of the dynasty and the Shiite clergy. The Safavids were particularly strong militarily, politically, and religiously vis-a-vis the neighboring kingdoms. Conflicts with the Ottoman Empire led to long wars, especially over the border area in western Persia, while the Uzbeks in the east repeatedly tried to invade Persian territories. These constant military challenges forced the Safavids to continuously improve their military organization, administration, and diplomatic strategies. In summary, the Safavids once again made Persia a powerful, politically stable, and culturally thriving great power. The combination of military strength, centralized administration, economic control, religious homogenization, and cultural promotion created a lasting legacy. The Shiite identity of Persia, which was established under the Safavids, still shapes the country today and clearly distinguishes it from its Sunni neighbors. The Safavids demonstrated how religious legitimacy, cultural promotion, and administrative efficiency can stabilize political power over centuries. Under their rule, Persia once again achieved political consolidation, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing, and became a regional center of power, art, and religion in the Islamic world.
Chapter 18: Qajars, Modernization and European Influence. The Qajar dynasty, which ruled Persia from 1789 to 1925, marked a period of transition between traditional monarchy and increasing integration into the geopolitical and economic structures of the modern age. Under the Qajars, Persia was a centralized state, but it was increasingly under pressure from European powers, leading to political, economic, and social transformations. This epic shows how Persia responded to internal challenges and external influences, laying the foundation for modernization in the 20th century. The Qajar dynasty was founded by Aga Muhammad Khan, who reunited Persia after years of political fragmentation. Under his rule, central power was strengthened, the capital was moved to Tehran, and a monarchy was established that presented the Shah as the undisputed ruler. The Qajars expanded the administration, stabilized the provinces, and established a bureaucracy that coordinated taxes, the army, and trade. Militarily, the Qajars were initially dependent on traditional formations, but these were inferior to modern European armies. This led to reforms in which European military advisors supported Persia, new weapons were introduced, and training and tactics were adapted to Western standards. Nevertheless, the army remained fragmented and loyal as local tribal leaders and regional elites continued to have influence. Politically, the Qajar rule was marked by internal tensions and regional rivalries. Tribes, local rulers, and rival families had significant influence, weakening the central power. At the same time, Persia faced growing pressure from European powers. Russia and Britain were striving for economic and political spheres of influence, especially in the Caucasus, Central Persia, and along the trade routes. The so-called Great Game conflicts led to contractual constraints, economic dependence, and territorial losses. The Qajars recognized the need for modernization and reforms in order to stabilize the empire and contain European influence. Road construction, military reforms, and the first attempts to centralize the administration were implemented. Schools and printing plants were established to promote education and information. Nevertheless, these reforms were limited due to a lack of financial resources, internal opposition, and significant influence from European powers. Economically, Persia under the Qajars was heavily dependent on foreign policy pressure and trade treaties. Concessions to European companies for oil, infrastructure projects, and trade led to short-term economic profits but increased dependence on Great Britain and Russia. At the same time, traditional agricultural systems remained central to supplying the population, while urban centers such as Tehran, Isfahan, and Tabriz grew as economic and administrative centers. Culturally, the Qajar period was a period of synthesis of tradition and modernity. Persian art, literature, and architecture continued to be promoted, but under European influence and new technologies. European influences led to new architectural styles, military innovations, and the introduction of Western science. At the same time, the Persian identity remained strong, which was evident in literature, painting, carpet art, and religious traditions. Religiously, Shiite Islam remained dominant, with the Shah at the top as a politically and spiritually legitimized authority. Religious institutions played a role in the formation, jurisdiction, and moral legitimacy of the rule. At the same time, tensions arose between traditional religious authorities, modernist reformers, and European influences that influenced social dynamics. The Qajar dynasty clearly shows how Persia balanced between traditional monarchy and modernization under external pressure. Military reforms, infrastructure projects, economic integration, and cultural adjustments were part of an attempt to stabilize the state and limit the influence of European powers. Nevertheless, the monarchy remained weak in the face of internal resistance and external threats. To sum up, the Qajar period was a period of transition in Persia, a period of modernization, European influences, military reforms, and cultural adaptation, but limited by internal tensions, financial bottlenecks, and political pressure. It paved the way for more far-reaching reforms in the 20th century and marked the turning point of Persia on its way from a traditional empire to a modern nation-state.
Chapter 19. The Pahlavi Dynasty, Nationalism, Modernization, and Revolution. The Qajars were replaced in 1925 by the Pahlavi dynasty, which centralized the monarchy under Reza Shah Pahlavi and led Persia into the modern age. The Pahlavi period was marked by radical modernization, nationalism, economic reform, and strong centralization, but at the same time by political repression, social inequality, and growing resistance, which ultimately led to the revolution of 1979. Reza Shah, an officer in the Persian army, used his military power and political skill to overthrow Qajar rule and take control of the entire country. He relied on a strong central government, created modern institutions, and pushed ahead with the modernization of the military, administration, and infrastructure. His goal was a sovereign, united, and strong Persia that could act more independently in the face of colonial and regional pressure. A central aspect of his rule was the modernization of infrastructure and industry. Roads, railway lines, schools, and hospitals were built to promote economic and social development. Tehran developed into a modern capital with administrative facilities, industrial plants, and modern communication systems. The energy supply, especially oil, was also controlled and modernized by the state, which strengthened the economic basis of the country. Reza Shah also attached great importance to nationalism and identity formation. He pushed for the revival of Persian history, language, and culture in order to create a unified national identity. Old traditions were partially abolished or modified. Western clothing was introduced, and educational reforms were implemented that propagated a modern, secular school education. These measures were intended to bind the population to the centralized, modern state power, but led to tensions with traditional and religious forces. Militarily, Reza Shah built a modern army based on the Western model, equipped with modern weapons, equipment, and training. This army served not only for internal stability and control over tribal territories, but also as a means of securing Persia's sovereignty against foreign powers. The modernization of the military strengthened the state, but also created dependencies on European advisors and technologies. Under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Reza's son, modernization continued, especially in the context of the White Revolution of the 1960s. Land reforms, industrialization, expansion of education and healthcare, and women's rights were central elements. The aim was to transform the country economically and socially and to limit the growing influence of religious and conservative forces. At the same time, political repression against opposition groups, especially left-wing, communist, and religious movements, increased considerably. Economically, the country benefited from oil wealth, especially after the nationalization and later modernization of the oil industry. International investment and economic cooperation with Western countries brought progress, but also led to social inequality. Prosperity was concentrated among urban elites, while rural areas and traditional social classes were often disadvantaged. These tensions increased discontent and created the basis for political opposition. Culturally, the Pahlavi dynasty relied on a mixture of modernization, Western influence, and national pride. Education, media, art, and science were promoted, while at the same time old traditions were transformed or pushed back. The Persian identity was strengthened, with historical references to Achaemenids, Sassanids, and Safavids being used as symbols of national greatness. Despite economic and infrastructural progress, political repression led to growing discontent. Opposition movements, both religiously motivated and left-wing, were persecuted, and freedom of expression was severely restricted. These tensions escalated in the 1970s when economic inequality, political repression, and Western influence mobilized a broad coalition against the regime. The Pahlavi dynasty shows how strong centralization, modernization, and nationalism can bring progress and stability on the one hand, but on the other hand, create social tensions when traditional structures and political participation are suppressed. Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi modernized Persia economically, militarily, and socially, but were unable to control the growing discontent. In summary, the Pahlavi dynasty led Persia into the modern age, expanded infrastructure and education, and strengthened national identity, while at the same time creating political repression, social inequality, and dependencies on Western power. This combination laid the ground for the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which ushered in the end of the monarchy and the introduction of the Islamic Republic, once again undergoing a profound transformation in Persia.
Chapter 20. The Islamic Republic. Revolution from 1979 to the present. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 marked a turning point in the history of Persia. After decades of modernization under the Pahlavi dynasty, there was a massive political, social, and religious mobilization against the Western-oriented monarchy. The discontent resulted from economic inequality, political repression, cultural alienation, and the growing influence of religious leaders who offered an alternative to the state and Western lifestyle. The revolution began with broad protest movements in the cities, supported by students, workers, clergy, and intellectuals. Central to this was the leadership of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who issued instructions for his return from exile in France and, as spiritual leader, propagated an Islamic alternative to the monarchy. Khomeini's message combined political mobilization with religious legitimacy, which welded the movement together across social and ethnic boundaries. On February 11, 1979, the monarchy was officially overthrown. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi fled into exile, and Persia was declared the Islamic Republic of Iran.
A constituent assembly established a system that closely linked religious leadership and state institutions. The supreme leader was given the highest political, military, and religious power, while the president, parliament, and judiciary formally represented democratic structures. This combination of theocracy and republican structure was intended to ensure political control, religious legitimacy, and social order. The early years of the Islamic Republic were marked by consolidation of power and profound social transformation. Political opponents of the revolution, including left-wing groups, monarchists, and secular intellectuals, were persecuted or removed from public life. The institutions of the new republic established tight control over the media, education, and public morality in order to strengthen Islamic ideology. At the same time, traditional religious structures were reactivated and integrated into the administration. In terms of foreign policy, the Islamic Republic was marked by conflicts and tensions. The Iran-Iraq War 1980 to 1988 under Saddam Hussein posed an existential threat, demanded enormous military and economic resources, and strongly shaped national identity. The war led to central mobilization, military reforms, and increased nationalism. But it also left behind destruction, economic strain, and social trauma. Economically, the new republic relied on control and integration of the oil and gas industry, the state's central source of income. At the same time, political isolation and international sanctions led to challenges in trade, investment, and technological progress. In the domestic economy, social programs, infrastructure projects, and educational initiatives were expanded in order to stabilize the population and state authority. Culturally, the Islamic Republic fundamentally changed Persia. The education system, media, and public spaces have been adapted to Islamic values and morals. At the same time, the Persian identity remained strong. Literature, art, and science continue to be promoted within the Islamic framework. This synthesis of religion and culture characterizes modern Iran to this day. Socially, the revolution led to new power structures and roles. Women were given formal rights, but had to comply with Islamic dress codes and were restricted in certain areas of public administration. Ecclesiastical and religious institutions gained considerable influence, while political participation through the elections took place within a controlled framework. At the same time, informal networks, NGOs, and citizens' movements emerged that articulated political and social interests. The Islamic Republic demonstrated that Persia could once again combine political transformation, religious legitimacy, and national identity to ensure social stability and international presence. Despite internal tensions, economic challenges, and geopolitical conflicts, the country maintains its political structure, influences the region, and preserves its cultural and religious independence. In summary, the Islamic Republic of Persia represents a continuous transformation from monarchy to modernization to a theocratic republican order. It combines political power, religious legitimacy, cultural identity, and social organization, and shows Persia's ability to redefine itself despite historical crises. The revolution of 1979 marked the end of the monarchy, ushered in a profound social, political, and cultural reorganization, and established Persia as a unique state in the modern Middle East.